And welcome back to the Sportsnaut interview. And today we are joined by Scott Dochterman, who covers college football for The Athletic. And we're going to focus our conversation on the Big Ten. They've been really impressive this year. Of course, there's a big game in the conference this year, Ohio State taking on Penn State. That's a big time matchup. And so we're going to break it all down here with Scott. Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
A little bit about the conference right now. Overall, they're looking real good. They have 3 teams in the top 4, and you can't overlook Indiana, what they've been able to accomplish this season. They're ranked 13th right now, 8-0. Really one of the feel-good stories of college football this year. But last year we had Michigan win the national championship. And again, I mentioned 3 teams within the top 4 in the AP poll right now. I think a lot of times people think about the SEC as the dominant conference in college football, but right now it's all about the Big Ten. What's some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are 4 teams that, in my opinion, have really established themselves as true playoff contenders, and 3 of them we already knew before the season, and that's Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State. They are legitimate playoff teams, and we expected that from day one. But Indiana is the surprise of the season. I think we can all agree to that. To lose, upwards of 44, I think, players in the portal, new coach, Curt Cignetti. And yet I saw them in person a couple of weeks ago, and they may have been the most impressive team I've seen all year. And I've seen Oregon and Ohio State in person as well. They do such an amazing job spacing the field on offense. They run really good stuff. And then, of course, they have a trigger man in Curtis Rourke, who it sounds like will be back this week. So all 4 of those teams are legit. Then there's kind of a glut of about 6 or 7 in the Big Ten that are capable of maybe upsetting one of those teams. But when it comes to the playoff, it's those 4 teams. And I think we'll go down to the wire to see if it ends up 3 or 4 in the actual playoff.
Yeah, I want to go back to your comments about Indiana. Of course, they were featured last week on College Game Day. It was in Indiana. Curt Cignetti doing an excellent job. I mean, Indiana was 3-9 last year. They're 8-0 this year. You mentioned 43 players left the program when he came in. He brought some guys over from James Madison with him, and he brought in a lot of other players. But, one of the things that I think could be a problem for Indiana is the weak schedule that they've played. Do you think that could impact their ability to make the college football playoff?
It can, because if they have one loss, then they kind of line them up against the other teams for that last, let's say, at-large spot, and you could have the Big 12 championship game loser. Right now, there are 2 undefeated teams in the Big 12. You line them against maybe the second best team in the ACC, maybe the 5th best team or 4th best team in the SEC. So their resume is light. There's no question about it. I think what they've done, though, is they were given that schedule, and it's not really their fault that Michigan and Washington, the championship participants last year, are not living up to that standard this year. And they've won every quarter. I don't think they've trailed in a game this year. They've been, I think almost every single quarter they've either won or they've been tied in, 7-7 or what have you. And they play well on both sides of the ball. It's really kind of remarkable, because Indiana is the biggest losing program in Big Ten history. I mean, even over Northwestern, they have a career winning percentage of 30% in the Big Ten. And yet, and over the years, they've rarely been even competitive for the upper levels of the Big Ten. And now you watched them the way they played against Nebraska, and there's been no letdown in the way they've played, even with a backup quarterback against Washington, which I think is a capable team of giving teams problems. So I look for Indiana, even with that schedule, to really hang in there towards the end. And I wouldn't completely rule it out that they'll give Ohio State a game all the way down to the end of the game.
Wow, so you're real high on Indiana. Yeah. Now, you outlined your top 4 teams that have kind of pulled away and separated themselves in this conference, and you alluded to how many teams may get into the college football playoff. Now, there's still a lot of games to be played, and some of these teams will end up facing each other face to face, like this weekend with Penn State and Ohio State. But realistically, is it possible that all 4 could get in, or you see maybe more realistically just 3 teams getting in?
I think that depends on if there are any upsets. I mean, if we go chalk the way out, and let's say Ohio State wins out, which it actually has the most difficult schedule, and it's not close among the four. If they go and they beat Penn State this weekend on the road, if they beat Indiana, if they beat their rival Michigan, and get to the Big Ten championship game, and then you look at Oregon, if Oregon remains undefeated, doesn't slip up at, say, Wisconsin or someplace like that, if they all get to the end and you got basically three teams at the end of the regular season with one loss and one undefeated, it's going to be really hard to keep those teams out. Now, I'll say this, you look at the SEC at large, there is a massive glut at the top, and there's going to be some separation over the next few weeks, but there are a lot of two-loss teams that if they were in a different league would probably be very strong contenders, or if they were in the Big Ten, they'd be a strong contender. And so I think it's just going to come down to the eye test and who can, if Indiana, for instance, if it loses a close game at Ohio State but remains dominant in all the others, it's going to put itself in that position. And Penn State, if Penn State loses a close game or this week but can win out, its schedule hasn't been as rigid, but it's still a very competitive team. So I think it's going to be 4 or 3 for the Big Ten, and I think it's going to be probably 4 or 3 for the SEC.
Right. Now, one of the teams that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about yet is Oregon, number 1 team in the country right now. They're getting it done with their new quarterback, Dylan Gabriel. Talk to us a little bit about what you think about them.
They've been a surprise to me because they've been able to handle the transition to the Big Ten better than you'd expect. I mean, to be able to match up with Ohio State, they do fit the part that they can be physical if they need to be physical. They spread you out. Dylan Gabriel's done a really nice job of being able to connect all kinds of receivers and run that offense the way they want it run. But then they can beat you in multiple ways. And the night I saw them play was kind of an off night for them. It was at Purdue. It was 6 days after they had they'd beaten Ohio State, but they had to go multiple time zones ahead, a short rest, and play probably the worst team in the Big Ten, and they won 35-0. But it just kind of looked like, in some ways, they went through the motions and won 35-0. But I think this is a definitely a team to watch. Now, their 2 road trips are not going to be easy. Going to Michigan, this is not the same Michigan team we've seen in the past, but they do have a formidable defense and a good running game. And then going to Wisconsin in a couple weeks down the road, both of those have challenges that I think Oregon on a neutral field is equipped to handle successfully. But as we know, going east and traveling and playing against in some hostile environments, screwy things can happen. And so I would give them a probably, there's an outside chance that they could slip up in one of those games.
Interesting. Let's get to the game of the week here. And this is with Ohio State traveling to Happy Valley, Penn State. This is a big time matchup. Not to mention they're in the same conference, which makes it even that much more intense. One of the big storylines heading into this game is the status of Penn State quarterback Drew Aller. And right now, Coach James Franklin is calling him a game time decision. I did see some clips out there on X that shows he's been practicing, but what's your expectations for him, whether he'll play in this game, and do you expect him to be effective in this game as well?
The latter is kind of up in the air if he gets in, but I think Drew Aller has been a really good quarterback for Penn State. He's been proficient in a lot of areas. I think last year he was 25 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's done a nice job of leading Penn State this year, but getting hurt at Madison was, in some ways, you hate to say it, but kind of a help to them, because then they realized with Bo Pribula going in, it really helped Penn State move forward. And in case they can't play with Drew Aller, that they'll have that opportunity, to have a quarterback who is 12-13 against the Badgers and be very competitive. Now, this is usually year in and year out, this is probably the number 2 marquee game in the Big Ten, an old school East Division game. But the Nittany Lions have lost 7 straight to Ohio State, and they've been the bridesmaid. And part of the reason that we don't have divisions anymore is Penn State was really adamant about getting rid of them because they kept running into that roadblock that is Ohio State. And so this is this is an important game for them, not just for this season, because you can still lose this game and go to the playoff and even go to Indianapolis, but you got to get over that mental hurdle. And if they can beat Ohio State, then for Penn State, that'll give them massive confidence, and it really kind of puts them in a position to where you might they might actually get to a Final Four or something out of this playoff. But if you lose again, it's like, again, what do we got to do? What can't we do right? Whereas you look at Ohio State and you kind of wonder what their mental makeup is right now. That, you know, they went out and lost to Oregon. They had a week off. Everybody expected a fired up Ohio State team, but they were taken down to the wire by Nebraska. And those kind of games happen. You know, Nebraska has a really good defense. They stopped the run and they just weren't able to generate much offense. So can they make that and translate that on the road against a team that, you know, is right behind Michigan as one of their big rivals?
Yeah, you know, is it a bigger game this week? Is it a bigger game for Penn State, who's, you know, looking for that to get over the hump? As you mentioned, they have lost 7 straight, and James Franklin has only beaten Ohio State once in his tenure. Is it a bigger game for them or Ohio State, considering if they lose, they would have 2 losses, and that could jeopardize their ability to reach the college football playoff?
I think it's a heart versus head decision, the discussion on this point, because, you know, heart, it's definitely Penn State. I mean, Penn State has to beat Ohio State. It's the team that it measures itself against, and it's fallen short, you know, since 2016, and only once in James Franklin's tenure have they gotten past the Buckeyes. However, in the head department or the you know, looking forward, it's really got to be Ohio State, because you lose a second game. I still think that they're playoff worthy if they go 10-2. They have a pretty tough schedule, but you're vulnerable, and you're not even at home. And so, you know, you don't want to go 10-2 and leave yourself wide open, because what happens if, say, both teams in the Big 12 go 12-0, and then you're facing a 12-1 team that in that situation. So, you know, when it comes to on paper, Ohio State needs it more, but when it comes to how they actually feel about this, it's definitely Penn State.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Ohio State has the most difficult schedule remaining of those 4 top teams that you outlined there in the Big Ten. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And Scott Dochterman, everyone from The Athletic, covers college football. Make sure you go out there and follow his work on The Athletic. And Scott, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.